So in this portion of their video series, we'll be jumping into the stage 1 identified desired results portion of the UbD template. So as a whole, it looks like this, where we indicate our content standards on the left, our transfer goals at the very top, our meaning or our understanding goals in the middle, and then finally at the very bottom, our acquisition goals, which are skills and knowledge. And we're going to spend some time in this particular video really diving into transfer goals, that very top part of the UbD template. So as you can see right here, it draws your attention to the top. And our transfer goals want us to consider what kinds of long-term independent accomplishments do we want students to be able to achieve. And our sentence starter is always, students will be able to independently use their learning to, and then we indicate our learning goal after that. It's positioned at the very top of the stage 1 portion of the UbD template because ultimately everything that the students learn with the other goals should be applicable to transfer of learning. Students should be able to independently apply their knowledge, skills, and understandings. So transfer is really about students intelligently and effectively drawing from their repertoires independently to handle particular contexts on their own. And I would say it's really thinking about those real world situations where we want students to be able to apply their learning. I feel like if you ask any teacher out there, they'd say, what I teach kids, I want it to be so meaningful that when they leave my classroom, they're able to use what I've taught them, what they've learned in my room. And so transfer goals help us really conceptualize and indicate what do we want students to be able to do in the long run by themselves in new contexts. So to get a little bit more specific in breaking down what a good transfer goal might be or might look like, we want to consider them being long-term in nature. So that goes back to that idea of we want students to be able to apply these goals or live into these goals, meet these goals, not only in our classrooms, but maybe at the next grade level, in other classrooms, and down the line when they leave Novi Community School District. We also want to require application in new situations. So to be able to transfer something is to be able to apply it in a completely different context and something that's very new to students, because then we know they've truly learned it and internalized it. Transfer goals also require independent performance with minimal teacher coaching. That is how we know students really have learned it, when they can do things, they can transfer their learning by themselves. And finally, we want students in their meeting transfer goals to think strategically about what learning applies. Chances are good they've learned a bunch of stuff, whether it's knowledge, skills, or understandings over the course of the unit. And part of being able to transfer that learning is to think strategically about, oh, this knowledge applies in this situation, but maybe some knowledge does not. I understand this, and because I understand this about what I've learned, I'm going to use my understanding in this way, but not in that way. So let's dive into a couple of examples so you can kind of see some examples of good transfer goals. So here's a science transfer goal. We have students will be able to independently use their learning to accurately predict and compare the climate of varied locations in terms of key climate determining factors. So that idea of being able to predict and engage in some comparative analysis is a touchstone of long-term scientific thinking. Students will have to apply their learning in new situations. So, and we don't know this, we'd have to look at their performance task, but there are a lot of different climates that students might learn about in the course of the unit. And so they might be provided with a new situation, a new location where they have to apply what they've learned to show that they can transfer it. This goal also would require independent performance with minimal teacher coaching. So we would want to see that students can meet this goal independently. And then this goal will probably require some strategic thinking about what learning applies. I'm assuming during the course of the unit, students will learn a ton about climate and climate determining factors, but only some might apply in the situation that they're provided with to prove that they've met this transfer goal. So students have to think strategically about how they will apply their learning and what actually fits the context. Here's an example of a health transfer goal. Students will be able to independently use their learning to determine what and how much they should eat to maintain optimum health and avoid nutritionally related problems. This is for sure something we would want kids to be able to think about long term. Healthy eating is something that matters throughout our entire lives. Um, Students might have to apply their learning in new situations. So they might be thinking about their own eating, and maybe that changes over time. Or we could ask them to think about, give them different scenarios of different people's health profiles and have them determine what or and how much those people should eat depending upon the circumstances, which I think also connects that idea of requiring strategic thinking about what learning applies. For instance, students might learn information about what people who might have type 1 or type 2 diabetes should eat to maintain optimum health, but maybe the situation they're faced with to prove that they've transferred their learning involves somebody who does not have diabetes. So students will have to think strategically about what they've learned to determine what actually matters in that context. Here's a math transfer goal. Students will be able to independently use their learning to recognize and solve real-world problems that are linear in nature. Linear functions are a big part of everyday life. And so being able to solve these real-world problems, that involves some long-term thinking for sure that will help beyond a math course. Depending upon the task that students need to complete in order to show that they can meet this goal, um, students might have to apply their knowledge, skill, and understanding as it relates to linear functions in a new, unfamiliar situation. And then students probably learned a ton about linear functions in the course of this unit. Maybe they learned about tables, charts, and graphs that are linear in nature or show a linear function. They might have learned how to write out a linear equation. But depending upon the real world problem that is provided to students, students will have to determine what of that knowledge, skill, and understanding they'll have to use to solve that real world problem. Finally, here's a world language set of transfer goals. Students will be able to independently use their learning to speak and comprehend in the target language in authentic situations and recognize and appreciate aspects of culture being studied. So that's pretty long term in nature. We really do want students to always have some sense of cultural appreciation for cultures that they might be immersed in or be introduced to. And we want students to, in a world language class, be able to apply the language in authentic situations beyond our classroom. Additionally, it might require application in new situations. So maybe the way that this goal might be measured, at least the top goal might be measured, is students are presented with a scenario in which they need to communicate with a person that they've never communicated before. Maybe it's a job interview that they're preparing for, or they have to meet a new person informally at a party. And students have to apply what they know strategically about the language that they've learned. So it might be inappropriate to talk informally at a job interview, but when meeting somebody in an informal setting like a party, maybe being extremely formal would be inappropriate. So students have to strategically use what they've learned about their language in order to meet that very first goal. So we have already talked about how good transfer goals are long-term in nature, require application in new situations, require independent performance with minimal teacher coaching, and require strategic thinking about what learning applies. On the screen, you can see there are 3 goals that could probably be improved. They might not truly be transfer goals. If you have a minute, now might be a good time to pause this video and try to rephrase any of those goals into true transfer goals based upon what you've seen in the video so far. In just a second, I'll go over some examples that might be helpful for you to see that I've created. All right, so hopefully you paused the video and attempted to redesign those goals so that they're actually transfer goals. And let me show you what I've done. So the very first goal is this. Students will be able to write a 5-paragraph essay. I mean, the 5-paragraph essay format could potentially help students down the line if they're in a time crunch and really have to crank out an essay in a format that's organized. But it doesn't necessarily require strategic thinking about what learning applies, and it might not be applicable in all sorts of new situations. So here's a transfer goal that I wrote instead that might fit our characteristics of good transfer goals a little bit better. I said this. Students will be able to write persuasively for a particular audience and purpose. Throughout their entire lives, students will have to write persuasively and independently. And depending upon the audience and purpose and the different situations that they're involved in, they have to think strategically about what they've learned about writing and what applies, given that the unique context of their situation. For the second goal in orange, we have students will be able to identify the causes of the Civil War, which might not necessarily be particularly strategic. So here's a transfer goal I wrote. Students will be able to use information from primary sources to evaluate potential causes of conflict. So in this instance, this goal could be applied in new situations because we didn't necessarily specify which conflict we were talking about. We could be talking about the Civil War or any other conflict that might have happened before that or after that or even during modern times. Being able to use information from primary sources to evaluate these causes of conflict might require or that this idea could be long-term in nature. We always want students to be able to attend to primary sources, to be able to evaluate cause and effect relationships. And students will have to think strategically about what they've learned about attending to primary sources in order to evaluate the causes of conflict and their implications for the effect of the conflict. Finally, the third goal is this. Students will be able to solve linear equations, which might not necessarily require strategic thinking about what learning applies. Sometimes just solving linear equations can be pretty plug and chug. So I switched it to this, to a transfer goal you've seen before. Students will be able to recognize and solve real-world problems that are linear in nature, that does require application in new situations, potentially strategic thinking, and so it does move beyond that idea of plug and chug. So hopefully this series was helpful for you in determining and learning more about transfer goals. Feel free to dive into your own template and create some transfer goals of your own. In our next video, we'll discuss understanding goals and the UbD template.